This is To the Point with Michael Williams.
Good morning. I hear it all the time, especially covering politics. Maybe you do as well, no matter your avocation. Social media, often some call it anti-social media. And whether it's eroding whatever was left of civility in day-to-day life, not to mention warping our politics, my guests, both from Florida Atlantic University, Drs. Kevin Wagner, professor and chair of the Political Science Department, and Dr. Robin Valacher, professor and interim chair of the Psychology Department. I thank you for being with us, gentlemen. Since you're senior here in terms of appearances on To the Point, we thank Dr. Valacher for being with us, and we'll hear from you in a moment, Doctor. But Dr. Wagner, social media, has it forever changed our political discourse? Where are we in terms of social media? Really a decade and a half in, where are we going?
Yeah, I would think it has. And you know, one of the ways it's changed is it's changed how we communicate to each other. It's changed who we communicate with and how quickly those communications happen. Amplify
those comments.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, the social media has allowed us to create our own sort of bubble universe in which we interact with people that agree with us. We get information from people that we already expect we know what their information is going to be. It allows us to, what we call confirmation bias. It allows us to sort of assume what we already believe is true. In a lot of ways, it makes it really hard for us to communicate with other people, because when they have a different opinion, we start thinking, well, everyone I talk to and everyone I interact with, largely on social media, already agrees with me. So if you don't, then there must be something wrong with you. That's a really problematic kind of thing to have in a democracy.
Dr. Valacher, we seem angrier, and a lot say it's because of social media.
That's probably the case, but I think we should look on social media not as a direct cause, but as an amplifier of other processes.
Okay, because a lot of us argue social media is the cause of this angst. You're arguing that it may reflect it. Talk about that more.
Okay, there's several features of human nature that it really picks up on. One is there's always been in-group, out-group tensions. That goes back to the Pleistocene. It shows up in football games. We watch FAU plays FIU, we choose for one side or the other. But there's terrorism, there's civil wars and so forth. There's always been that antagonism. Okay, so it plays to that. There's also a tendency in groups to get coherence. People in a group develop a common shared reality.
As Dr. Wagner said.
Right, and that can be functional because you have to coordinate your actions to do things, but it can lead to things like groupthink and de-individuation, mob violence and so forth. So in and of itself, it kind of works both ways. Then you have to take into account the fact that everybody tries to achieve some sort of mental coherence. We don't like to live in a world of disassembled facts. We like closure, we like coherence. And you put all those things together. Individually, they're fine, but there's a positive feedback among them. And social media has a way of amplifying them, ratcheting that up to a degree that's not so functional.
And amplifying the dysfunction in your mind to a great degree, most feel it has.
It does, because when you have in-group, out-group tensions, and all you hear is your in-group, and you see the out-group vilified, and you have no countervailing feedback from the other side, it reinforces, it produces a reinforcing cycle of that attitude.
Dr. Wagner and I will talk about it in the political sphere a lot, but it's not just there. It seems like we're an angrier culture. I hear people all the time say people are just waiting to be angry, and there's almost an outrage industry that many argue on all sides is built off social media, and people are waiting to be outraged. They feed off it, some profit off of it as well. Your thoughts?
Just positive feedback loops. So if you just hear one point of view over and over again, it comes back in an echo chamber fashion. It just polarizes your way of thinking. In the old days, when we grew up, we had people on the street corners, we heard different people talking in the neighborhood and so forth. We hear different points of view, and we have to moderate a little bit. Today, you can just defriend people and only accept people that you want to hear, and that just produces an incredibly positive feedback loop that just spirals to extremity.
If we know fundamentally what some of the big issues are, as you two have laid out, and we appreciate that, then Dr. Wagner, where are we on the curve of trying to deal with those? Or is the horse so far out of the barn? Can we ever, to use the term, make social media a more constructive piece of our discourse? Because a lot of people fear we can't.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question without a really lot of good answers. I mean, historically, right, if you remember traditional broadcast television, if you go back far enough, we had what we called two-side information flow, which is you wanted to broadcast to a large enough audience that you wanted to cover the waterfront of possibilities, of explanations, of understanding. The internet and social media in particular allows us to narrowcast. So we can go for a small audience and still be relatively profitable, and in fact be very profitable. So there isn't a lot of motivation for people to broadcast widely because they don't want that. The other thing that we found, especially in social media, is that messaging with emotion travels a lot farther, especially negative emotions. So if you provoke people, if you get them angry, you get greater engagement. There's more money that way.
The New York Times looked at that after the January 6th insurrection. They talked to Facebook, people on social media. I believe Facebook was one of the venues they used. And some said back in the day, I'd get a few hits because I said I went to the gym. Then suddenly I became provocative and angry, and my hits went way, way up. And it was addictive. And to that, Dr. Valacher, many argue outside the political sphere that we're looking at something that's become terribly addictive. The Wall Street Journal just did a huge series. They talked about teenage girls particularly becoming addicted to Instagram. And just before we went to air, you said there's almost a generational divide in the impact social media has had on us. Talk about that.
Yeah, there's an interesting book by Gene Twenge, a psychologist at San Diego State, who argues that after 1995, people born after 1995 grew up with cell phones and social media and so forth, and that's all they know. They have lots of usual social interaction cues you get in face-to-face interaction, and they get a false sense of reality. They don't get the normal feedback you get in face-to-face interactions and so forth, and they rely on that. So they have the only perception of reality they have is what is presented in packaged form over social media.
And it's warped oftentimes and creates pressures on them in a tremendous way.
Yeah, so if you go on a vacation, you come back, you had some good times and bad times, look at someone else's post on their vacation, all you see is the good times.
Mm-hmm. Is the human brain really wired for the kind of constant input? And that may sound odd for somebody who believes so strongly, as we all do, in freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And yet sometimes I wonder, and I think I have a lot of viewers who would agree, are we really wired mentally for almost this constant 24/7, 365 input of voices and this cacophony and these images with really no off switch anymore?
That's an interesting point. There's two aspects of that. One is that we would think with the internet, there's so much information out there, people wouldn't have to listen to interpreters. They just dig up the information on themselves. It turns out with information overload, people restrict how much information they attend to.
Okay.
And they look for interpreters, and they look for people to tell them what it all means. That brings up the second point. The people they listen to are effective to the extent that they use social influence rules, speaking loudly, repetition, being attractive, and so forth. Little to do with expertise and knowledge. So most effective communicators are those who really play to those tricks of the trade and social influence.
I was going to argue mainstream media is often vilified, and yet people will get sources of information from people who may have no expertise at all, no governors, no competing voices in their newsroom to say, hey, wait a minute. Dr. Wagner, we talk about that a great deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably a pretty good indicator was how big an issue Nicki Minaj's comment on COVID-19 was, because influencers on the internet often have very little relationship to expertise whatsoever, and their words can travel considerably much further. I mean, part of the problem ultimately is that as consumers of information, we have a hard time discerning that which is legitimate from that which is just somebody talking. And when you hear people, I hear a lot of people going, I did my own research, but did you do your own research? I mean, what did that mean to you?
And in the political sphere, what about politicians on all sides? Of course, former President Trump's, whatever you'd say, people said he knew exactly what buttons to push on social media. You see Republicans and Democrats alike pushing those same buttons. Critics of all sides argue they're weaponizing social media. How do we pull back? How do we disarm? And really, can we? And what do you say to people watching the broadcast that say, okay, you're telling me about a lot of problems. I feel what you're saying, but how do we find a different path, or can we?
Yeah, it's actually worse than it actually seems, because the
Great.
I just put it that way. But so yes, they reach out to you in social media, but they also reach out through online news platforms that look like news organizations, but they aren't necessarily. And the platforms follow the tweets of the politicians so that they can get hits to their platform. The politician says to the platforms that are doing really well for him or her, go to that platform. So they interact in a very, a way that amplifies each other often in a very negative way.
But how do we inoculate ourselves, at least to some extent, against that? We've seen it with COVID. Horrible misinformation flying across social media, again, playing to anger, paranoia, to angst, to the loudest voices. Is there some way we can at least partially, and pardon the pun, given the COVID crisis, we're going to inoculate ourselves against that? What do you say to people, whether it's in your classroom, doctor, or to people you meet, about where we go from here, how we can find a better way?
It's extremely difficult. I mean, there's a phenomenon in psychology known as bad is stronger than good, which is why the negative emotions and negative broadsides against people and so forth play so well. Just say nice things, that sounds great, but people listen to the bad stuff. So it's very hard to get around that. We encourage people to occasionally break out of their echo chamber, listen to other sources and so forth. We point out that you should look at the reliability of the sources you listen to. I'm not sure how far that's going to take us.
Can we continue to exist cohesively as a society on the path we're on right now?
Well, that's a big one. That's a big question.
You think about it, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, we do. I'm hopeful. I like to think, for example, that people who live in areas that have a narrow view of the world because they're rural, don't are exposed to all the rapid social changes going on. Once they see TV, they go to movies, they have some money, they take trips to countries that would otherwise disparage, see them as interesting places to be. that might open them up a little bit and let's be a little less disparaging about other points of view.
And in fairness, that applies to people whether they're in a rural area or city dwellers who are often decried for the same thing, taking stereotypical views and amplifying those on social media. Dr. Wagner, from your perspective, and again that will tilt toward the political sphere, what do you say about the same question? How we at least begin to try to have a different kind of conversation?
Well, the answer is actually very similar. Ultimately, the answer lies with our ability to discern good information from bad information, our recognition.
But how do you do that when there's such a tsunami of it?
Yeah, well, part of it's not that hard to some respect, which is you have to be able to source your information. Is it in more than one place? Are you getting it from other areas? Are you getting it from different types of sources? Do you know what the source's bias is? You have to be a much more intelligent consumer of information going forward. That's really the only way out of it. But it's worth pointing out, and we discussed this a little bit before we even started. This technology is new, and people are still sort of getting their hands on exactly what to do with it and what the pathologies are, what are the negatives are, and we're starting to understand them now. As we grow as a society and as a younger generation becomes, who's a little more technology savvy, becomes, more a part of the electorate, I think you'll see the ability to handle this stuff a bit better. But this came on very quickly, and for a lot of people, it became sort of instantaneous. I'm going to go into this thing where the people say things that I really like. I think, in the future, we might be a bit better at it.
Dr. Valacher, a final comment from you, and let's talk about, for all we're talking about the clear issues with social media. The fact of the matter is there are many positives. It also, in a positive way, has amplified the ability of people to get their message out and their voices out. So let's at least end on the positive aspects you see and talk about how we can continue to grow with those.
Okay, I think a positive aspect is looking down the road years in the future, as Kevin was pointing out. I think one of the problems we have in this country is not just social media or the disruptions we've experienced recently, but education. I think people don't know civics. People don't know what the Constitution. When I was in 8th grade, and I just went to a public school, was not a rich kid at all, we had to learn the Constitution. I don't think many people know what the Constitution is. Separation of powers, the checks and balances that go on there. Knowing about psychology, knowing about confirmatory bias, about the pressures that allow people to seek out influence that may not be reliable. Teaching people, having better education, history, science. People distrust COVID research because they're always changing their mind. That's the nature of science. Science is constantly evolving. Teaching people about what science is, giving them better education, starting in grade school through high school and so forth, might be a way in the long run to deal with some of these issues.
It creates a better base to discern and go through information. Dr. Wagner, from the political side of the aisle, although really all of this interrelates between what we're seeing in general society and the political sphere, your final thoughts and message.
Yeah, I think education is a good place to start, and people having some recognition of the dangers that the internet are. Because this is still relatively recent, so you have more people starting to understand, if I go to these sites and I get this kind of information, these things can be wrong. The other thing we just barely touched on, but because the world is very busy and it's happening, we're very isolated, and the internet becomes a place where we feel that we're not isolated. And oftentimes we'll join in a group, and there's an old saying in political science that people are innocent of ideology, which is to say, oftentimes it's about feeling like they belong in a group, they identify with a group, and then the ideology comes a little bit later. Because people feel like they're isolated and they're alone, they use social media to sort of create a group. Sometimes that can be dangerous if the group is pretty far out there or is pushing some pretty strange things.
We have 30 seconds left. Dr. Valacher, to moms and dads and grandparents watching, the best message of what they should be saying to young people, to their youngsters.
Open up their minds, listen to other people talk. Don't just close your mind, just don't rely on one source. Give them some information. Maybe monitor or at least ask them to think about what they're listening to.
And maybe real conversations and break away a little bit from social media.
Break out of the bubble.
Every now and again. Doctors, we appreciate you at least putting on the table things all of us need to be thinking about now and into the future. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you.
Florida politics, key issues from COVID to abortion. Next.